This is Rieko. I met her in Japan in June of 2018. And that's Fiona. I met her in Singapore in May 2018. And this is Patrick. I met him in Austria in 2010. And this is Senora Yolanda. I met her in Bolivia in 2007. As you've probably guessed, I love to travel. 34 countries and counting. I like traveling because of the people, the culture, the food, and the adventure. But traveling also reminds me that this thin slice of reality we call home is a distorted periscope. And there are many differences for people across each of those countries, but the one thing that each of them have in common, they all have access to a pocket supercomputer. Since the launch of the iPhone 14 years ago, we all experienced a shift around the globe as everyone gained access to the internet with a pocket supercomputer. That progress forced the entire design and tech industry to fundamentally shift our way of thinking about how we design and build products that work on an infinite number of screen sizes. Now consider this. The fundamentals of commerce have shifted. It's no longer thinking about one more thing on the checklist. The world now operates through a truly global economy. And if you want to thrive in this world, products are now required to support multi-languages and be multicultural. But here's the thing. We all chose an industry that asks us to be constant learners. It's one of the things that ties us together. Constant learning is a part of our DNA. And like mobile disrupted the desktop industry, 1,000 songs in your pocket disrupted the music industry, access to the internet has disrupted the commerce industry, and we will all be required to fundamentally shift our way of thinking and recognize that international is the new mobile first. Hi, everyone. My name is Robyn. I am a user experience developer at Shopify, and thank you so much for joining me virtually on this amazing event for International Women's Day. My home is currently in Canada, but I have lived in Austria and I've also lived in Singapore. I joined the international team at Shopify as a user experience developer in 2017 and currently focus on scaling our marketing user experience efforts around the globe. And for those of you that don't know, Shopify is an entrepreneurship company. We focus on making the important things easy and everything else possible for entrepreneurs. And today, I'm here to talk to you about world domination. Well, what I really want is to share more about the journey of Shopify going to a global audience and what it took for us to get there, with a goal to build an experience that supports all entrepreneurs everywhere around the world. And here's the thing, we're all driven by impact. And so instead of designing for millions of users in our native speaking markets, we're now designing for billions of users that don't look or act anything like us. And here's the thing, we don't have all the answers, but luckily we can take inspiration from many different places. Slack is available in 8 languages. Etsy in 10 languages. Airbnb, 62 languages. And Netflix, 32 languages. Facebook, 101 languages. And Google, a whopping 149 languages. As of December 2017, Shopify was an English-only product. And today, Shopify is available in 21 languages. Now, here's the deal. International is really hard. And through this process, to start, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about languages and translations. How many of you have had your colleagues say, just use Google Translate? Have you ever seen a reaction or a response like this? This is a really good example of a Google Translate fail. And in many instances, when I've used Google Translate with a taxi driver, when I've been abroad, the first thing that happens is a giggle out of their mouth because I sound like a 6-year-old. The international team operated a lot like a startup within a really large organization, maybe even something like a pirate ship. Our goal for the first year was to iterate quickly, identify quick wins over moonshots, and find a way to translate and bring an English-only product to a global audience. In the first 6 months during our international journey, we translated Shopify into 6 new languages. And that doesn't really sound impressive, but it sounds incredibly impressive when I tell you that all of Shopify was built using hard-coded English strings. It kind of looked a little something like this. And it really wanted to make your head explode. And here's the thing. Through the process of translating Shopify, we made many mistakes. But like anything in software, you can try and fail and try again. So Shopify has an incredibly large code base. And the first step, like any major refactoring effort, is to stop the bleeding. At Shopify, we were deploying hundreds of hard-coded English words daily. And if we were to translate everything that existed a year ago, we'd have to do it again tomorrow, and again the day after, and again the day after that, as new hard-coded words were added. And it was really unrealistic to align everyone with an email or to fix everything with a single pull request. But fortunately, Shopify relies on automated tooling like COPS and linters and tests to communicate best practices and correct violations. It's the perfect medium to tell developers about new patterns and show contextual solutions. And with that in mind, we built COPS and linters to detect all type of violations. Hard-coded strings in HTML files, and hard-coded strings in specific method arguments, or hard-coded date and time formats and currencies. And how we built the COPS and linters could be a complete talk on its own, but I want to emphasize the concept here. We knew the pattern to avoid, and so we built tools to inform and correct. And relatively speaking, because it has such a large code base, we wanted to be able to automate the mundane. And we wanted to extract all the hard-coded strings and move them to dictionaries. And so we know developers are naturally lazy, and we didn't want to do everything manually. And really, the best developers I know are strategically lazy. So we did what any engineer would do. We built tools. And the results weren't perfect, but leveraging the linters that we already built, identifying violations was easy. We ran them again against every file of our application and found thousands and thousands of content in need of translation. From there, we opted for the simplest pattern. Create a translation file named after the current module, move the actual content in there, and reference it through a key created from a mix between the file path and the content itself. And so we built a tool that did just that. And slowly but surely, one file after another, all the content was moved into these dictionaries. And the results weren't perfect. A lot of content was duplicated. The reference names weren't always intuitive, but despite this, it got us on the right track. It put things in motion, and we were able to extract most of the basic mundane stuff, such as static content, documentation, and we were left with the edge cases such as complex interpolation. Now, preparing content for the translation was one thing, but getting it actually translated is another one. We needed a way for developers and product managers to request new translations to talk to translators in a lean, simple, automated way. Shopify relies a lot on GitHub, CI linters, dashboards, COPS, and the merge queue. And so when we started to think about ways to connect developers to translators, we naturally looked to GitHub. Could GitHub's API, coupled with our new translation management system API, bridge the gap between developers and translators? The international team built a tool called Translation Platform. a simple and efficient way for developers and translators to collaborate in a streamlined and automated way. Each repository of an organization defines its own configuration file that indicates where the language files and what the source language is and what are the targeted languages. And so with the configuration file in place, helped by APIs on both ends of the flow, our translation platform now automatically detects changes and new files, infers the format, and creates new translation requests on our translation management system. When translations are ready and approved, our platform fetches the new content, appends it to the project, either through a new pull request or as new commits in the original one. And the translation platform made gathering translations a seamless process. Similar to running our tests on CI integration. It gives us visibility of the entire workflow while allowing us to gather logs, metrics, and data so we can provide SLAs on translation requests. The translation platform, with its apparent simplicity, was the key successful introduction to our new translation process across the entire company. And so now, this is kind of an example of what the English source file will look like and the German translation that will come back. And now that we have a few tools in place, we needed to be able to share them. And as I mentioned before, we acted a lot like a pirate ship, but this approach doesn't allow us to scale our team. And so we needed to learn how to fully integrate international, give our team what they needed to build the muscle of empathy, the understanding and empathy required to develop great products. Now, when you visit a new country, what does that experience look like for you? As I mentioned previously, I normally travel a lot and really love the experience of new cultures. The beginner's mindset continues to be an experience I live for. And with each new country, the experience is just a little bit different. And up until my first trip to China in 2019, it had been a pretty long time since I had experienced any form of culture shock. Every trip I take now usually starts the same. Season dependent, the same clothes in my capsule wardrobe. I download offline maps. I flag the key locations I need to be aware of, like the hotel, the conference venue, meeting locations, and any relevant apps that I might need for that particular location. And in China, the usual travel witch rules didn't apply at all. Google Maps, not a chance. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, staying in touch with friends was spotty at best. Offline Google Maps wasn't even available. And every once in a while, I forget a few things when I go traveling. And to take that a step further, this trip, I forgot to pack underwear. It was a little bit embarrassing. I had big meetings scheduled for the next day, and it was 9 p.m. at night. And my initial expectation was to hunt for the nearest Victoria's Secret the next day after a sink washing and a hang to dry. Mentioning the predicament to my colleague, I was surprised when the first comment wasn't, well, we can go and find some place tomorrow. It was, what size are you? Where are you staying? What's your room number? And within 40 minutes, my colleague had new underwear delivered to my room. My mind was blown. I said, how did you do that? I just ordered them on WeChat. And at this point in time, I had only ever heard of the capabilities of WeChat. The way I describe it to my friends is a super version of WhatsApp. At this point, I had never really experienced the depth of what this application could do. How many of you have ever used WeChat? It's kind of like a one-size-fits-all type of application, but so much further than what we've experienced in North America. The next day, we went to one of my colleagues' favorite restaurants for lunch. We started selecting items to order, but the server didn't seem to be coming to our table. My colleague asked if there was anything else or if we wanted more. And she opened her phone, scanned the QR code, and started ordering right from her phone. And don't get me wrong, ordering from a computer is not a new experience. But at that time, scanning a table QR code and seeing which items were not available, it certainly was. Now that COVID has hit, more and more restaurants have started to adapt something similar. But generally in North America, it's only to go and see the menu, and it doesn't have that same level of interaction that you would see. Paying the bill with little or no interaction with our server, it was also really impressive. The food came as soon as we order it, and then we paid and we left. There was very little interaction. Following lunch, we were looking to explore Shanghai a bit. And the fastest mode of transport in most cities is the metro or something similar. It's easy enough to purchase a pass and tap on or off. And instead of doing this, my colleague handed me her physical pass, and I asked her what she was going to use. She said WeChat. Again, it was WeChat. I share these experiences because as users, we have this unspoken expectation about how our lives function in the day-to-day, in particular when it comes to technology. And when you look at each of these experiences individually, it doesn't really amount to much. But as soon as you start to understand how the individual parts fit into a larger picture, we can start to explore what the unspoken rules of engagement are and dive deeper into the invisible user experiences. And the way I understand user experience is that invisible yellow brick road that we guide our user base down. Localization is also a tough thing. We did a Japanese redesign a few years ago, and the feedback was, that guy is Korean. The next challenge was bringing international best practices to our entire team with the goal to build an experience that supports all entrepreneurs everywhere around the world. And when that experience doesn't fit a specific culture, tailor it. And one of the UX principles that we brought to the table was planning for text expansion. When we launched Shopify in 6 new languages in June of 2018, during that process, we watched our design break in many areas of the product. We watched as text started to move beyond the bounding boxes of buttons. We watched our grid totally break. And we watched as navigation became illegible to our English-speaking merchants, to our non-English speaking merchants. Now, to help stress test your designs and assume worst case scenario for text length, we use something called pseudolocalization. What the heck is pseudolocalization? Pseudolocalization is a software testing practice that expands text to replicate other languages. The end result was quite surprising with pseudolocalization. Not only were we able to distinguish between hard-coded and dynamic content, but we were also able to visually test our UI against the longer words while maintaining readability. And something like this, or something like this in the product. There's a great sketch plugin from Smartling that allows you to easily see how your design might look once you convert it into pseudolocalization. You have the ability to select other languages. For example, Dutch and German would increase the text by about 50%. And you'll get a result like this. If you're a Figma user, there are also additional plugins that you can use for pseudo translation. My personal favorite is the Pseudoloco by Jared Hardy. You can see in this case, in the top left-hand corner, the English version of the product that we're trying to showcase, and then in the bottom with an expanded text version, and you can see where it starts to break down the product. We also make it super easy for our developers. And so we built tools that allow them to view pseudo translations live in their development environment. And we've built internal tooling that allows us to easily switch between languages. And this includes a pseudo translation. And you can see the updates live in action. This obviously doesn't replace real languages, but it does a great job bringing awareness to our design practice while we're waiting for translations to come back. And a good rule of thumb is consider stress testing with German because it's generally 30% longer than English, or testing with a character-based language like Japanese or Chinese, because it generally breaks quite a few of our core features like domains. The next UX principle that I like to suggest is planning for maintainability. And the question I like to ask is localization or globalization? And let's take a super simple example. For every visual, we export to desktop, tablet, mobile, and we also need to export these images for Retina display. And so one visual equates to 6 images for English only. Add 19 languages into the mix and you have a whopping 114 images. That's a lot, and that's not great for website performance. Or we could consider something like globalization and using images free of text to be translated. Those same 6 images for a single visual are now independent of the language we select, possibly even the culture. As we see more and more companies moving towards globalization and taking their companies international, one of the good examples that I had found while I was looking for this was Slack. And Slack has done a really great job when showcasing their product and their marketing collateral. And Japan is something that I would consider a monoculture. You don't see the diversity you would normally see in Europe or North America. And for this reason, the Japanese culture is still very traditional and sensitive to radicalized imagery. And to reflect this, the product images used in this particular example with Slack featured colored boxes in place of the avatars. And you can see this example here. Now, the screen mockups are also done in the browser with CSS and HTML, making the screenshots or the product visuals fully scalable and independent of language. And this is a really great example of how we could take and use it. And you can see it starts to scale down to a responsive mode and shows and hides different aspects of the product visuals. And since then, since we started our international journey, we started exploring and implementing a similar localization practice. On Shopify.com, you'll see specific imagery. And on our German site, Shopify.de, you'll also see different imagery. In this particular case, you'll see yourdomain.com, but you'll see den firmenname.de. And we continued that evolution of best practices. And so in this particular case, in our Japanese and our German, you'll see the product visuals, they start to feature, they start to explore how far or how much it enables us to expand the language or plan for text expansion and maintainability and translate everything quite easily. So in English, you'll see something like this. In German or in Japanese, or if you're looking for something that's agnostic and you don't quite have the translations yet, you can go with something more generalized like this. Now, the evolution of this experience of localizing our product visuals on our marketing collateral has taken quite a bit of time, and we've since implemented our own version of abstracted depictions of the Shopify UI. Initially, we started out with SVGs, but opted to go with HTML and CSS implementation for many reasons. And now many of our pages use these HTML and CSS-based UI illustrations, which is what we call them. And there's a blog post series that discusses the exploration and implementation of our UI illustrations across the Shopify.com domains. And this allows our design and development teams to more easily build visuals that localize and scale across many regions into many countries. Now, there are about 2,000 characters in the Japanese language. There's something called hiragana, kanji, and romanji. And when we first launched in Japanese, we ran into a UTF-8 encoding issue where our store subdomain would turn into an unreadable string of characters when our users would sign up for a new store. Now, all of our non-Latin based languages have the opportunity to define their own unique subdomain when signing up to prevent this type of encoding issue. You'll see in this particular case, on the left, we have the 3-field sign up, whereas on the right, we have the new version of this with the 4-field sign up where they can dictate what they want their store subdomain to be. And in all other instances, characters sometimes just wouldn't show up with our custom Shopify Sans interface, typeface. Now, we started going off one by one, testing out different languages. And some of the challenges that we ran into were we needed to specify the typefaces that we wanted to use on our Shopify.com domains for particular languages. So Japanese and Chinese were huge for this. And in character-based languages like these, it is conventional for text to be read from top to bottom without rotating the characters. While in Latin-based languages like English, it is more conventional to rotate the letters when the words are presented vertically. And therefore, when laying out text vertically, always use CSS attribute, the writing mode, vertical left or right, rather than transform and rotation of 90 degrees so that the browser can do what's correct based on what the character set is being used. The third UX principle that I like to talk about is cultural differences. And it's not just language that separates us in terms of communication. Cultural differences are more localization than translations. In Japan, when I was skiing on a trip, you can get hot coffee that's readily available from a vending machine in a can. And this is what a standard map looks like in North America. But in Japan, it features Japan in the center instead of on the right. And in Canada, we reference postal codes and provinces. And in France, you don't have provinces. In Japan, culturally, it would be considered offensive to ask for your first name prior to your last name. And today, most modern website design features a clean and simple look with a lot of negative space. And as you can see in the Japan site, it's more cluttered, featuring lots of densely packed text, which is too small to read here, but you get the idea. And it's not because the Japanese site is localized haphazardly. This look is spot on for Japanese customers who prefer to see everything on the first page. And this is what I mean by an example of really how much content you can see that users in Japan are looking for. It really does go on forever. Over the years, we have explored and tested many different versions of Shopify.jp. In the first instance, on the left, you'll see where we start to localize some of our images and some of our iconography, whereas the second version or iteration of the site was a fully localized version of Shopify.com. However, it had way more content that was available. And the third and the fourth iteration, we ended up moving back towards a more global, cohesive brand, where the design was more consistent alongside Shopify.com. We had localized imagery and localized testimonials, but it really depends on the design approach that you want to be taking and the strategy from the long-term perspective. Now, some of the more challenging questions when it comes to cultural differences is when to take a more traditional approach for localizing imagery. Shopify is progressive when it comes to showcasing gender roles and generally takes the approach of representing the exact opposite of what's expected. But international is hard. And at scale, it's even tougher. And some of the other things that come up are peer validation, which is a huge way to build trust when you're stepping into new markets. We always try our best to feature local users, merchants in our case, in our imagery, localized testimonials of some of our users. So in this particular case, you'll be looking at shopify.com and shopify.es. There's two different versions that are being showcased here. You'll notice the testimonials are totally different. And you'll also notice that we showcase recognizable brands to each country. Jason Maiden put it really well. The world is diverse. And so if we're not thinking about diversity, then we're not thinking about people. And if we're not thinking about people, then we're not designers. We're just makers of stuff. The internationalization and the localization of any platform isn't a small task, but an ongoing effort. In the same way that our security experts never sleep, we expect to continually bring awareness to our peers about language specificities, market subtleties, and local requirements. Thank you so much for listening. We're always hiring, and I would love for you to come and join our initiatives of taking Shopify around the globe.